Hello and welcome. I am glad you have found your way here tonight, to this place of wind and water. We are about to set sail on a long, slow journey across the cold gray sea. This story is designed simply for calm and for rest. There's no need to follow every word. Feel free to let your mind drift with the tide and to fall asleep whenever you are ready. Find your most comfortable position. Close your eyes and listen to the sounds of the voyage. Our journey tonight takes us back 1,000 years to the deck of a Viking longship. We will explore the endless, hypnotic routine of the men who called these ships home and the silent, crushing vastness of the sea. So rest now and listen. Our story begins not on the open ocean, but in the deep, quiet heart of a Norwegian fjord in the late spring. Let us call our Viking Bjorn. He is young, barely 18 summers, but his hands are already calloused and strong from a life of farming and fishing. He stands on a wooden jetty, the air crisp and cold, smelling of pine trees, damp earth, and the salty promise of the sea. Before him, floating on the still, dark water of the fjord, is the Longship. It is a magnificent and terrifying creature. It is long, slender, and elegant, its hull carved from ancient oak, its lines designed for both speed and resilience. The high, curved prow is carved into the snarling head of a dragon, its painted eyes seeming to stare into the very soul of the water. This is a vessel built for trade, for exploration, and for war. For weeks, Bjorn has watched it take shape on the shore, a community effort led by the master shipwright. He has heard the rhythmic sound of axes shaping the timbers, the hiss of hot tar being applied to the planks to make them waterproof, the shouts of men working together. The ship is more than just wood and iron. It is the embodiment of his village's wealth, its ambition, and its spirit. And now he is to become a part of it. He is not a great warrior, not yet. He is a simple farmer's son, joining his first long voyage. He is driven by a deep, restless yearning that he cannot put into words, a desire to see the world beyond the steep, dark mountains that have defined his entire life. He is also driven by a need to earn his own wealth, to bring back silver and honor to his family. He says his goodbyes on the shore, quiet, stoic embrace from his father, a long, lingering look from his mother, her eyes filled with a fear she will not speak. He then picks up his sea chest, a simple wooden box containing his few possessions, a spare woolen tunic, a whetstone for his axe, a small carved wooden horse his father made for him as a child, and he walks the plank onto the deck of the ship. The deck feels alive under his feet, a living thing that gently shifts and moves with the water. The ship is a flurry of controlled activity. Men are loading the final provisions: barrels of fresh water, sacks of hard, dry rye bread, tubs of salted fish and butter. There are no luxuries here. This is the food of survival. The other men are checking the rigging, the thick ropes of walrus hide that controlled the grate. Square sail made of heavy woven wool. Bjorn finds his assigned spot. The ship is an open vessel, with no cabins, no shelter from the elements, save for the sail that can be used as a tent when they are at anchor. His space is the small section of the bench next to his oar. This bench and the sea chest that slides underneath it will be his entire world for the next several months. He will row here, he will eat here, and he will sleep here, curled up under his woolen cloak. The Jarl, the leader of the voyage, gives the final command. With a series of low rhythmic calls, the men take their places at the oars. The mooring ropes are cast off. The ship, with a great collective groan of wood and men, begins to move. It glides silently through the still, dark water of the fjord, its dragon head pointed towards the open sea. Bjorn takes his oar, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The movement is new to him, a long, powerful pull that uses the muscles of his back and legs. He focuses on the man in front of him, matching his rhythm, becoming a single, small part of the great living machine that is the ship's crew. The only sound is the rhythmic splash and pull of 30 oars dipping into the water in perfect unison, and the quiet guttural count of the coxswain. For hours they row down the long winding fjord. They pass familiar landmarks, a small fishing village, a sacred grove of trees, the last farm on the edge of the wilderness. With each pull of the oar, Bjorn feels his old life slipping away behind him. As they near the mouth of the fjord, he can feel a change in the air, a new energy. The gentle lapping of the water is replaced by the deep, resonant surge of the open ocean. The sky widens. He has left the safety of the land. Before him lies the endless, gray, and unforgiving expanse of the North Sea. The true voyage has begun. As the Longship cleared the protective embrace of the fjord, the world changed. The calm, dark water was replaced by the deep, rhythmic swell of the open North Sea. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying the clean, raw scent of salt and distance. The Jarl, a great bearded man with eyes the color of the winter sea, gave the order to raise the sail. This was a moment of transformation, a ritual of commitment to the voyage. The great mast, carved from a single towering pine tree, was hoisted into place, its base slotting into a massive block of oak known as the curling, or old woman. The crew moved with a practiced, coordinated energy. Bjorn, still clumsy and unsure, tried to follow their lead, pulling on the thick, stiff ropes of walrus hide. The sail, made of heavy, oiled wool and dyed a deep, rusty red, was immense. It was a patchwork of many pieces, reinforced with a crisscrossing grid of leather straps to give it strength against the fierce ocean winds. With a series of guttural shouts from the coxswain, the crew hauled on the ropes. The great sail unfurled and rose up the mast, catching the wind with a sound like a giant's exhalation, a deep, satisfying humph. The ship seemed to come alive. It leaned into the wind, the dragon head on its prow seeming to snarl as it bit into the waves. And a surge of speed pressed Bjorn back against his sea chest. The rhythmic splash of the oars fell silent, replaced by the hiss of the hull cutting through the water and the constant low hum of the wind in the rigging. Bjorn's new world was one of endless rolling gray. The sea and the sky were often the same color, a vast, monotonous canvas that stretched to every horizon. The feeling of being a tiny, fragile vessel in this immense emptiness was both exhilarating and deeply humbling. He learned to read the subtle changes in the water's surface, the different patterns of the waves, the signs that foretold a change in the weather. He saw pods of dolphins, their sleek, dark bodies arcing gracefully through the waves alongside the ship. One afternoon, he saw the distant, misty spout of a great whale, a sight so mythic it left him speechless. Life on the ship quickly settled into a grueling, hypnotic routine. The crew of 60 men was divided into watches. For hours, Bjorn would be on duty, his hands raw from the ropes, his face and clothes perpetually damp with sea spray. His main task, when the wind died and the great sail hung limp and useless, was to row. The work at the oar was a test of pure endurance. The long, heavy pine oars required the strength of a man's entire body. He would sit on his bench, his feet braced against the wooden ribs of the ship, and pull. It was a long, sweeping motion, a rhythm that was drilled into him by the coxswain's steady count. 1, 2, 3, 4. He would row until his back screamed in protest, until his shoulders felt like they were on fire, until his mind emptied of all thought except the simple, repetitive motion. To keep their rhythm and to lighten their spirits, the men would often sing. They sang old songs of gods and heroes, of great battles and forgotten kings. The deep guttural sound of their voices would roll across the empty sea, a song of defiance against the vast, crushing silence. Bjorn, his own voice hoarse, would join in, the shared song making him feel a part of something larger than himself. When not rowing, there were endless tasks to be done. The ship was a demanding mistress, as the seawater constantly sloshed over the low sides, and a team was always tasked with bailing, using simple wooden buckets to throw the icy water back into the sea. The walrus-hide ropes had to be checked constantly for any signs of fraying, and the tarred planks of the hull had to be inspected for leaks. It was a constant, vigilant battle against the corrosive power of the ocean. Bjorn learned about the men he sailed with. There was old Eric, the grizzled helmsman, who could read the waves and the stars as if they were a book, his hands never leaving the great steering or at the stern. There was Gunna, a massive, boisterous warrior, his arms covered in tattooed knots, who would boast of the raids of his youth and mock the new recruits mercilessly, testing their spirit. And there was Leif, a quiet, watchful man who taught Bjorn how to mend a sail with a bone needle and how to tie the essential knots that held their world together. Reputation here was not built on land or family, but on the simple realities of the voyage. A man was judged by his strength at the oar, by his willingness to take on the hardest tasks, by his courage when the sea grew angry. Bjorn, determined to prove his worth, worked until his body ached, never complaining, always watching and learning. As the long, cold twilight descended, the watch would change. If the wind was steady, the off-duty men would huddle together for warmth under their woolen cloaks. A small, shielded firebox in the center of the ship might be lit, its tiny flame a precious and welcome sight. The evening meal was simple, a piece of dried, salted fish as tough as leather, and a chunk of hard rye bread washed down with a mouthful of water or weak ale from a barrel. It was in these quiet hours, under a sky filled with a breathtaking canopy of stars, that the stories would begin. Old Eric would tell tales of the voyages of his youth, of discovering new lands, of encounters with strange peoples. Gunnar would recount the sagas of the great heroes of Odin and Thor, his voice a low, rumbling chant. Bjorn would listen, his exhaustion forgotten, his imagination filled with images of fire-breathing dragons and epic battles. He was no longer just a farmer's son. He was a Viking, a traveler on the great whale road, a part of a story that stretched back into the mists of time. After the first week at sea, the initial exhilaration of the voyage began to fade, replaced by a deep and profound monotony. The endless rolling gray of the North Sea, which had at first seemed so majestic, now felt like the walls of a vast, featureless prison. Every direction looked the same. The sun would rise from a gray horizon and set into a gray horizon, and the days between were a long, unchanging expanse of water and sky. The routine, which had been a new and exciting challenge, now became a source of chronic pain and fatigue. Bjorn's hands, which he had thought were tough from farm work, were not prepared for the relentless friction of the oar. His calluses had long since broken, and his palms were a raw, weeping mess of blisters that would sting with excruciating pain every time he gripped the oar. But to stop rowing, to show weakness, was unthinkable. So he would bite down on a piece of leather and pull, his pain a secret, silent agony. The constant dampness was another form of torture. Nothing was ever truly dry. A fine, cold mist seemed to rise from the sea itself, and the spray from the waves was a constant companion. His woolen tunic was perpetually damp and cold against his skin, and a deep, seeping chill settled into his bones that no amount of rowing could warm. He learned to sleep in this state of dampness, his body curled into a tight ball for warmth. But his rest was shallow and unsatisfying. The food, which had been a simple novelty, became a grim daily ordeal. The water in the barrels began to taste stale, with a faint green taste of algae. The salted fish was tough and incredibly salty, and he would have to gnaw on it for a long time, the taste more of salt than of fish. The hard rye bread, stored in sacks, had become infested with weevils, and it was common to see the small black insects crawling out of a piece of bread. The veteran sailors would make a grim joke of it, calling it a little extra meat, but for Bjorn, the sight of it turned his stomach. He learned to eat in the dim light of dusk, so he could not see what he was putting in his mouth. It was during the second week that they encountered the first true test of their voyage. The day had been unnaturally calm, the sea a flat, glassy sheet, the air heavy and still. Old Eric, the helmsman, kept sniffing the air and staring at the horizon. His weathered face creased with a deep, worried frown. "Storm is coming," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A bad one. The sea is holding its breath." As the afternoon wore on, the sky in the west began to darken, a deep, bruised purple that spread across the horizon like a stain. The wind began to rise, not as a gentle breeze, but in a series of strange, sudden gusts that seemed to come from all directions at once. The Jarl gave the order to lower the sail. The crew moved with a frantic, disciplined energy. The great red sail was brought down and secured, and the heavy mast was lowered and stored. The ship was now just a bare hull to be powered by the oars alone, a small, vulnerable creature preparing for the onslaught. And then the storm hit. It came not with rain, but with a wall of wind, a physical force that seemed to want to tear the ship apart. The glassy sea was whipped into a frenzy of steep, chaotic waves. The wind howled through the rigging with a high, terrifying shriek, like the scream of a great beast. The ship, which had felt so sturdy and powerful, was now tossed about like a piece of driftwood. Great waves of cold green water crashed over the sides, completely swamping the deck and threatening to flood the entire vessel. "Bail!" the Jarl roared, his voice barely audible over the fury of the storm. Bjorn, along with half the crew, grabbed the wooden buckets and began the desperate, back-breaking work of throwing the water back into the sea, a seemingly hopeless task as each new wave brought more water in. The other half of the crew was at the oars, not to propel the ship forward, but to keep it from turning broadside to the massive waves which would have certainly capsized it. They rowed with a grim, desperate strength, their faces illuminated by the stark, terrifying flashes of lightning that now split the dark sky. The stories and the songs were gone. There was only the roar of the storm, the shouted commands of the Jarl, and the strained grunts of men fighting for their lives. Bjorn bailed until his arms were numb, his body soaked and freezing, looked up at the stern and saw old Eric, his legs braced, his entire body straining as he fought the great steering oar, a single, determined man wrestling with the full power of the ocean to keep the dragon's head pointed into the wind and the waves. In that moment, Bjorn understood that a Viking voyage was not about glory or riches. It was about this brutal, terrifying, and intimate struggle for survival against the raw, untamable power of the sea. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity. Night fell, but the darkness was absolute, a suffocating blackness broken only by the terrifying, stark white flashes of lightning that revealed a world of liquid chaos. Bjorn, along with the rest of the crew, worked in a state of pure instinctual survival. They bailed water, they held onto the ropes, they huddled together for warmth. Their bodies moving with the grim efficiency of men who have accepted the possibility of their own imminent death. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, a wave of truly monstrous size rose up out of the darkness. It was a moving wall of black water, far larger than any that had come before it. A collective shout of alarm went up from the men. The ship climbed the face of the wave at a sickening angle, the timbers of the hull groaning as if they were about to be torn apart. For a long, heart-stopping moment, the ship seemed to hang there, suspended between the sea and the sky. Then they crested the wave and plunged down the other side with a stomach-lurching drop. A huge torrent of icy water crashed down onto the deck, sweeping several men from their feet. A loud, splintering crack echoed through the storm as one of the precious barrels of fresh water, torn from its lashings, was washed overboard and vanished into the churning blackness. The loss was a devastating blow, a sentence of thirst to be served later, but there was no time to mourn it. They had survived the wave. The crew fought on through the long, cold hours, their bodies numb with exhaustion, their minds a fog of fear and cold. Then, as the first hint of a bruised gray dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, a change occurred. The wind, which had been a constant, high-pitched shriek, began to lose its edge, descending into a low, guttural moan. The mountainous, chaotic waves slowly began to organize themselves into a more rhythmic, if still colossal, swell. The storm was breaking. As the sun rose, a pale, watery disk in a sky of racing clouds, the full extent of the storm's aftermath was revealed. The Longship, their proud dragon of the sea, was battered and wounded. A section of the carved gunwale had been splintered, and several oars were lost, but she was intact. The mast was secure, the hull was sound. She had endured the sea's worst fury and had not broken. The crew were in a similar state. They were soaked to the bone, their faces pale and drawn with exhaustion, their bodies a canvas of bruises and rope burns. But they were alive. A profound and weary silence settled over the men. They looked at each other not with triumph, but with the quiet, shared understanding of those who have passed through a great ordeal together. The boasting of Gunnar was gone, replaced by a quiet respect. The new recruits like Bjorn were no longer seen as boys, but as men who had faced their first storm and had not faltered. The Jarl, his own face grim and tired, led a simple, solemn offering to the gods of the sea. He poured a ladle of ale over the dragon prow, a tribute to Nygard for safe passage, and then slammed the butt of his spear on the deck, a salute to Thor for the strength to endure. It was a simple, powerful ritual, a reassertion of their faith in the face of the overwhelming power of nature. The storm had been a crucible for Bjorn. The naive farm boy who had left the fjord was gone, washed away in the fury of the night. In his place was a young man who now understood the true nature of the sea. He had faced a profound elemental terror and had found within himself a core of resilience he never knew he possessed. He looked at the raw, blistered palms of his own hands, not with self-pity, but with a strange, hard-won sense of pride. These were no longer the hands of a farmer. They were the hands of a sailor. In the days that followed, as the sea calmed and the sun returned, the ship was a hive of quiet, methodical activity. The men worked to repair the damage, their movements economical and efficient. Leif, the quiet craftsman, showed Bjorn how to splice a frayed rope and how to patch the damaged sail. There was a new sense of camaraderie, a bond forged in the shared terror of the storm. As Bjorn sat at his oar bench, chewing on a piece of dry fish, he felt a sense of belonging that was deeper and more real than anything he had ever known. He had earned his place here. He was a seafarer, a member of the crew, a man of the Longship. His initial journey, the transformation from boy to Viking, was complete. But the great, gray, empty ocean still stretched before him, and he knew with a certainty that was both frightening and exhilarating, that his true story was only just beginning. In the aftermath of the storm, a strange and profound quiet settled over the Longship. It was not the peaceful silence of the fjord, but a vast, empty silence, the sound of an indifferent ocean. The crew, having survived the fury of the sea, now faced a new and more insidious enemy, the great crushing monotony of the voyage. The days began to blur into one another, each one a near-perfect copy of the last, a long gray continuum of existence. The world was reduced to a few simple, unchanging elements. There was the endless rolling expanse of the gray-green water, its surface sometimes calm and oily, other times choppy and flecked with white. There was the sky, a high, pale, and often featureless ceiling of cloud that offered no clues, no sense of progress. And there was the ship itself, a long, slender sliver of oak and iron, a tiny, self-contained universe adrift in an immense void. The novelty of the journey, the thrill of adventure that had pulsed in Bjorn's veins upon leaving home was now a distant memory. It had been replaced by a deep, weary resignation. His life was now governed by a strict and unvarying routine, the only defense against the madness that could grow in the empty spaces of a long voyage. The day was divided into watches, and his existence was a simple binary. He was either on duty or he was not. The on-duty hours were a cycle of labor. If the wind was good, his job was to manage the sail and the rigging. He would sit for hours with his hand on a sheet rope, his eyes on the great red woolen sail, feeling for the subtle shifts in the wind's pressure. He learned to make tiny adjustments, to ease a rope here, to tighten one there, to keep the sail perfectly filled, to coax every last bit of speed from the breeze. It was a task that required a constant, low-level state of concentration. When the wind died, as it often did for days on end, the sail would be lowered, and the dreaded command would be given to take up the oars. This was the true, back-breaking heart of the voyage. Bjorn would take his place on the simple wooden bench, his feet braced against the ribs of the ship. He would grip the long, heavy pine, or its surface worn smooth and slick by the hands of the men who had come before him. The work was a rhythm of pure physical agony. The coxswain would set the pace with a low guttural chant. The 30 oars would rise and fall in perfect, hypnotic unison. The movement was long and powerful, a full-body exertion that started in the legs, traveled up the back, and ended in the arms and shoulders. He would row until his muscles screamed, until his raw hands burned, till his mind emptied of all thought except the simple, brutal rhythm. Pull, lift, push, dip, pull, lift, push, dip. The off-duty hours offered little in the way of rest or comfort. When his watch was over, Bjorn would be soaked with either sweat or sea spray, his body aching with a deep penetrating fatigue. His designated space was the small section of the OR bench he shared and the sea chest that slid underneath it. This was his only piece of territory on the ship. He would crawl into this small space, often next to another sleeping crewman, and try to find some rest. But true sleep was a rare luxury. The deck was hard, the air was cold and damp, and the ship was never still. It was in a state of constant, gentle motion, a rolling and pitching that he had become accustomed to, but which prevented a deep restorative sleep. He would doze in a state of semi-consciousness, his body still feeling the ghost of the oar's rhythm. The food, too, was a part of this great monotony. The meals were identical, day after day. A chunk of hard, dry rye bread, often riddled with weevils, she would tap against the oar bench to knock out the worst of the insects. A piece of salted, dried cod so tough he would have to gnaw on it for a long time, its flavor overwhelmingly of salt. And a ration of water or weak ale from the barrels, which now tasted of stale wood and the faintest hint of rot. This was his life, a simple, brutal cycle of labor, exhaustion, and meager sustenance. The epic sagas sung around the fire back home had never mentioned this part of the Viking life. They had never spoken of the endless, crushing boredom, the saltwater sores that refused to heal, the gnawing hunger, or the profound, almost spiritual loneliness of being a tiny speck of life in a vast, empty, and indifferent world of water and sky. The Longship itself was not a passive vessel. It was a living, breathing creature that demanded constant work and attention. Bjorn quickly learned that there was no such thing as truly off-duty. There was always a task to be done, a small battle to be fought against the relentless decay of the sea. The ship was their mother, their shield, and their most demanding master. When the wind died and the sea turned to a flat, glassy plain, the true test of the crew's spirit began. The great red sail would be lowered, and the Jarl would give the command to take up the oars. This was the raw, brutal engine of the Longship. Bjorn would take his place on the simple wooden bench, his feet braced against the wooden ribs of the ship, and grip the long, heavy pine oar. The surface was worn smooth and slick by the hands of the men who had come before him. The work was a rhythm of pure physical agony. The coxswain would set the pace with a low, guttural chant, a simple hypnotic beat, and the 30 oars would rise and fall in perfect, splashing unison. The movement was long and powerful, a full-body exertion that started in the legs, traveled up the back, and ended in the arms and shoulders. He would row until his muscles screamed in protest, until his raw hands burned as if held to a fire, till his mind emptied of all thought except the simple, brutal rhythm. Pull, lift, push, dip, pull, lift, push, dip. To keep their rhythm and to lighten their spirits, the men would often sing. They sang old songs of gods and heroes, of great battles and forgotten kings. The deep guttural sound of their voices would roll across the empty sea, a song of defiance against the vast, crushing silence. Bjorn, his own voice hoarse, would join in, the shared song making him feel a part of something larger than himself, a single voice in a great chorus of endurance. When the wind was with them, the work changed from brute force to a task of skill and constant vigilance. The great square sail was a powerful but temperamental servant, requiring a team of men to manage the complex web of walrus-hide ropes or rigging that controlled it. Bjorn learned from the older sailors how to read the wind, not just by its feel on his face, but by watching the subtle patterns on the surface of the water and the flight of the gulls that sometimes followed their ship. He learned the art of trimming the sail, making tiny adjustments to the ropes to catch every last ounce of power from the breeze. In a rising wind, a frantic and coordinated effort was required to reef the sail, to reduce its size to prevent the mast from snapping. The men would scramble, their bare feet sure on the wet deck, their voices shouting commands against the rising howl of the wind. It was a different kind of labor from rowing, more skill, less raw power, but just as demanding. Beyond propulsion, there was the endless necessary work of maintenance. The Longship was a flexible vessel, designed to bend with the waves, but this meant that it was never entirely waterproof. Seawater constantly sloshed over the low sides and seeped through the planks of the hull, collecting in the bilge at the bottom of the ship. A team of men was always tasked with bailing, using simple wooden buckets to throw the icy, sloshing water back into the sea. It was a thankless, monotonous, but absolutely vital task. Several times during the voyage, a section of the hull would need to be retarred. The men would heat a foul-smelling mixture of pine tar and animal fat in a small iron pot. Then, using mops made of rags tied to a stick, they would apply the hot, sticky black liquid to the seams between the planks. The smoke from the tar pot would sting their eyes, and the tar itself would get on their hands and clothes, a black, stubborn stain that was impossible to remove. The sail, their primary engine, also required constant care. The heavy oiled wool was strong, but the relentless wind would find any small weakness. A small tear, if left untended, could quickly become a catastrophic rip. During calm days, men would sit on the deck, their legs crossed, using heavy bone needles and thread made of sinew to meticulously stitch and repair any damaged sections. It was quiet, focused work, a moment of relative peace in a life of hard labor. Bjorn learned that to be a Viking sailor was to be in a perpetual state of work. There was always a rope to be spliced, a loose plank to be secured, a dull axe to be sharpened on a whetstone. The ship was a demanding creature, a hungry beast that consumed their energy and their attention without pause. It was a constant, vigilant battle, not against a visible enemy of flesh and blood, but against the slow, inevitable, and corrosive forces of wind, water, and decay. As the weeks at sea bled into a month, the physical hardships, while still present, became a familiar part of existence. The greater battle was now a psychological one, a war waged against the vast, crushing emptiness of the open ocean and the insidious enemy of boredom. Man's mind, left idle for too long in such a vast and featureless world, could begin to fray. And so the crew filled the quiet, off-duty hours with the small, essential rituals that kept their spirits tethered to the world of men. Not mending sails or bailing water, many of the men would take out small knives and pieces of driftwood. Carving was a common and respected pastime. Bjorn would watch Leif, the quiet craftsman, his hands surprisingly delicate for their size as he slowly worked a piece of oak. With patient practiced strokes, he would coax a shape from the wood a horse's head, a snarling wolf, or an intricate knotwork pattern. The only sound would be the soft scrape of the knife, a quiet creative act in a world of brute force. These small carvings were not just idle whittling. They were a way to create beauty and order, a small act of defiance against the surrounding chaos. Games were another vital escape. The most popular was Henny Fataf, a strategic board game, a Viking version of chess. The board was often simply the flat lid of a man's sea chest, with the grid pattern carved directly into the wood. The pieces were simple, carved from bone or stone. One player, with a king and a small band of defenders, would start in the center of the board. The other, with a larger force of attackers, would occupy the edges. The goal for the king was to escape to one of the corners of the board. The goal for the attackers was to capture him. The game was a slow, deliberate, and silent affair. Bjorn would watch two of the older veterans play for hours, their faces masks of deep concentration, the only movement the slow, considered placement of a piece. The game was a microcosm of their world, a story of a small, determined band of men surrounded by a larger, hostile force, where survival depended on strategy and foresight. But the greatest weapon against the crushing monotony of the sea was storytelling. The Vikings were a people of the spoken word. Their history, their religion, and their laws were not written in books, but were carried in the memories of their poets and storytellers, their skalds. Every evening as the long northern twilight settled over the ship, the crew would gather. The off-duty watch would huddle together on their sea chests, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the small firebox or the pale glow of the stars. One of the older warriors, a man named Brand, was their skald. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble, a human instrument that could be both thunderous and as quiet as a whisper. He knew all the old sagas, the epic tales of their ancestors. He would begin his recitation with a low rhythmic chant, and a hush would fall over the ship. Listen, Brand would begin, and I will tell you of Sigurd, of the Volsung line, he who knew no fear. He traveled to the Nita Heath, where the dragon Fafnir guarded a great hoard of gold. The dragon's scales were of iron, and no sword could pierce them. But Sigurd, guided by the wisdom of Odin, dug a pit in the dragon's path, the path Fafnir took to the water. Brand's voice would paint a picture in the minds of the crew. They could see the dark, shimmering scales of the great dragon as it slithered from its lair. They could feel the ground tremble under its immense weight. And as Fafnir passed over the pit, Brand would continue, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Sigurd, hidden below, thrust his sword, Graham, upwards, deep into the soft underbelly of the beast. The dragon's black blood, hot and venomous, poured down into the pit, but Sigurd was protected by the earth. And so the great Fafnir, the terror of the heath, was slain. He would tell them tales of Thor's journey to the land of the giants, of his great hammer Mjolnir, of his endless battle against the forces of chaos. He would recite the riddles of Odin and the long, complex genealogies of their kings. For hours the crew would sit in rapt silence, their own hardships forgotten as they were transported to a world of gods, heroes, and monsters. For Bjorn, these stories were more than just entertainment. They were his education, his connection to his people, taught him what it meant to be a Norseman, to value courage above all else, to face one's fate or word with a grim and uncomplaining determination, and to strive for a glorious death that would earn a place in the halls of Valhalla. The stories gave meaning to their own long, perilous journey. They were not just sailors on a ship, they were actors in their own saga. These rituals, the quiet carving, the strategic games, the epic tales were the invisible rigging that held the crew's minds together. They were the essential tools that allowed them to navigate the vast, empty, and psychologically dangerous ocean of a long sea voyage. They were as vital to their survival as the sail, the oars, and the sturdy oak planks of the Longship itself. As the voyage stretched on, the ship became a small, self-contained world, governed by its own unique laws and rhythms. But it was a world that had to navigate through a much larger and often featureless one. One of the greatest challenges they faced was the simple, terrifying question, where were they? On the open ocean, with no land in sight for weeks on end, the art of navigation was the art of survival. Bjorn watched the older sailors, especially Eric, the helmsman, with a sense of profound awe. They had no maps as he would know them, no modern instruments. Their maps were etched into their memories, and their instruments were the sun, the stars, and the sea itself. On clear days, Eric would use a simple sun compass. It was a small wooden disc with a pin in the center. He had carved lines into its surface, marks that corresponded to the length of the pin's shadow at different times of the day, for a specific latitude. It was a simple but effective tool that allowed him to maintain a rough east-west course. But their most reliable guide was the sky. At night, Eric would steer by the North Star, a fixed point of certainty in the ever-shifting heavens. During the day, he would judge their direction by the position of the sun at what he judged to be midday. It was not a precise science, but an art form, a deep, intuitive understanding of the celestial rhythms that had been passed down through generations of seafarers. They also learned to read the more subtle language of the ocean. A veteran sailor could determine his general location by observing the natural world. He knew the flight patterns of certain seabirds. Gannets, for example, would fish far out at sea during the day, but would always fly back towards their nesting grounds on the coast as dusk approached. To see a flight of gannets in the evening was to know the direction of the nearest land. The color and temperature of the water held clues, as did the types of seaweed that would sometimes drift by. The sighting of a whale was not just a moment of awe, but a navigational marker. A certain species were known to frequent specific feeding grounds along their migration routes. This was a deep, instinctual knowledge, a form of being in conversation with the sea itself. For Bjorn and the crew, this natural world was also a deeply mystical one. They did not see the world through a lens of science, but through the rich and often terrifying tapestry of their mythology. The sea was not just water. This was the domain of the Jatnjayr, a powerful and temperamental sea giant. The great rolling waves were his 9 daughters. A calm sea was a sign of Jyr's pleasure, a storm his rage. The sailors would make small offerings, dropping a piece of carved wood or a bit of food into the water, a gesture of respect to the great unseen powers that governed their fate. A thunderstorm was not just a weather event. The flash of lightning was the glint of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. The roar of thunder was the sound of his goat-drawn chariot, riding across the clouds as he waged his endless war against the giants of Jotunheim. The shimmering, ethereal lights of the aurora borealis on a cold, clear night were the reflection of the Bifrost Bridge, the trembling, rainbow path that connected their world of Midgard to Asgard, the home of the gods. Even the wildlife was imbued with a deeper meaning. The ravens that would sometimes circle the mast, far from land, were not just birds. They were Hugin and Minnin, thought and memory, the two ravens of Odin the Allfather, sent as messengers or omens. A sighting would cause the crew to fall silent, their eyes following the bird's flight, trying to decipher their meaning. This belief system was not a superstition. It was their reality. It gave a sense of meaning and order to a world that was often chaotic and terrifying. The greatest test of their navigational skill and their faith came during a period of thick, disorienting fog. For 3 straight days, a dense, wet, and chilling fog bank enveloped the ship. The world shrank to a few yards of gray water around the hull. They could not see the sun. They could not see the stars. They were adrift in a featureless white void. During this time, a deep unease settled over the crew. All work, save for the essential tasks, fell silent. The men spoke in hushed whispers. They were truly lost, their celestial guides hidden from them. Their lives were now completely in the hands of old Eric, the helmsman. He stood at the steering oar, his face a mask of intense concentration, his eyes closed. He was not steering by sight, but by feel. He was reading the direction of the deep ocean swell, the long, slow, almost imperceptible waves that are generated by distant storms and are not affected by the local winds. It was an act of incredible, almost supernatural skill. He kept the ship on its course, using nothing but the feel of the water against the rudder. The crew watched him in silent awe, their trust in him absolute. On the morning of the 4th day, the fog finally lifted. The sun broke through, and Eric, after a few quick calculations with his sun compass, gave a single, satisfied grunt. They were still on course. A collective sigh of relief went through the ship. This was the rhythm of the sea. Long periods of mind-numbing monotony, punctuated by moments of terror and guided by a deep, ancient knowledge of the natural and the supernatural world. The ordeal of the first storm was now long past, but the psychological challenge of navigating a vast, empty, and myth-haunted ocean was their constant, daily reality. It was a world where a man's survival depended on his strength, skill, and the whims of the gods he was careful never to anger. For weeks, the Longship had sailed under a sky of monotonous gray, on a sea that was equally predictable in its endless rolling rhythm. The crew had settled into the deep, grinding routine of the voyage, their days governed by the changing of the watch and the simple, repetitive tasks of sailing and rowing. But one afternoon, a subtle change began to work its way into the world, a change that the older, more experienced sailors felt in their bones long before it was visible to the eye. The day had been unnaturally calm, the sea a flat, oily sheet of dark green, the air heavy and still, making it difficult to breathe. A strange, coppery light began to infuse the afternoon, casting an eerie, unhealthy glow on the sail and the faces of the crew. The seabirds, which had been following the ship for days, suddenly vanished, their cries replaced by a profound and unsettling silence. Old Eric, the helmsman, stood at his steering oar, his weathered face creased with a deep, worried frown. He sniffed the air, then cast his gaze to the western horizon, which was beginning to accumulate a dark, bruised-looking bank of clouds. "A storm is coming," he said, his voice a low rumble, not to anyone in particular, but to the ship itself. "A bad one. The sea is holding its breath. Jaeger is angry." As the afternoon wore on, the sense of foreboding grew. The dark bank of clouds in the west grew with an unnatural speed, rising like a great dark wall that threatened to consume the sky. The wind, which had been absent all day, began to stir. It came not as a gentle breeze, but in a series of strange, sudden, and warm gusts that seemed to come from all directions at once, flapping the great red sail erratically. The Jarl, his face grim, gave the order to prepare the ship. A new energy, a tense and focused urgency, replaced the crew's lethargy. The games of Hennefeta were quickly packed away. Quiet carving ceased. Every man moved to his task with a disciplined speed. The great red sail, their primary engine, now became a liability. A giant canvas that could catch the storm's fury and tear the mast from the ship. "Lower the sail," Jarl roared, his voice cutting through the rising moan of the wind. Bjorn, along with a team of other men, scrambled to their positions. They pulled on the thick, stiff walrus-hide ropes, their hands finding their familiar places. The great sail, which had seemed so majestic, was now a wild, bucking beast. It flapped and cracked in the erratic gusts with a sound like thunder, threatening to tear itself free. With a coordinated, grunting effort, the men brought the sail down. They fought the heavy, wind-swept wool, folding and binding it tightly to the yardarm. Then came the most difficult task, lowering the mast. The great pine mast was a heavy, 30-foot-long timber. It was unstepped from its housing in the massive curling, block and carefully lowered until it rested in specially designed wooden cradles, or crutches, at the bow and stern. The ship was now bare, a long open hole, ready to face the storm with its oars and the strength of its crew alone. The final preparations were made in a flurry of activity. All the sea chests, barrels of water, and supplies were checked and secured with extra lashings. The precious cargo of trade goods was covered with oiled hides. The ship was being transformed from a vessel of passage into a fortress. Every man working to ensure its integrity against the coming onslaught. And then the storm hit. It came not with rain, but with a solid wall of wind, a physical force that struck the ship with a deafening roar. The glassy sea was whipped into a frenzy of steep, chaotic, white-capped waves. The wind howled through the rigging with a high, terrifying shriek, a sound like the scream of 1,000 mythical beasts. The Longship, which had felt so sturdy and powerful, was now tossed about like a piece of driftwood, a tiny, insignificant sliver of wood in a world of unimaginable fury. Great waves of cold, green water, far larger than those of the first storm, began to crash over the low sides, completely swamping the deck and threatening to flood the entire vessel. "Bail," the Jarl roared, his voice barely audible over the fury of the storm. Bjorn, along with half the crew, grabbed the wooden buckets and began the desperate, back-breaking work of throwing the water back into the sea, a seemingly hopeless task as each new wave brought more water in. The other half of the crew was at the oars, not to propel the ship forward, but to fight to keep it from turning broadside to the massive waves, which would have certainly capsized it. They rowed with a grim, desperate strength, their faces illuminated by the stark, terrifying flashes of lightning that now split the dark sky. The stories and the songs were gone. There was only the roar of the storm, the shouted commands of the Jarl, and the strained grunts of men fighting for their lives against the cold, uncaring rage of the North Sea. The storm did not pass. It deepened. The world outside the ship became a churning, violent chaos of black water and gray, driving rain. The waves were no longer individual swells to be navigated. They were liquid mountains, their peaks as high as the ship's mast, their troughs deep, dark valleys. The Longship would climb the face of one of these great waves at a sickening, almost vertical angle, the timbers of its hull groaning in protest. Held together only by supple withes and the master shipwright's skill, for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, the ship would be suspended at the crest, exposed to the full fury of the wind, before plunging down the other side with a stomach-lurching drop that left the men feeling weightless. The sensory assault was total and overwhelming. The roar of the wind was a constant, deafening presence, a sound so loud it seemed to vibrate in Bjorn's teeth. It was a sound that scoured all other noises from the world, leaving only its own elemental fury. The sea was a relentless physical attack. Every few moments, a great wave of freezing green water would crash over the side of the ship, a solid, brutal impact that would sweep men from their feet and leave them gasping in the icy deluge. The work of survival was a grim, desperate cycle. Bjorn, along with half the crew, was on bailing duty. It was a battle they were constantly losing. For every bucket of sloshing, debris-filled water they threw over the side, a fresh wave would dump twice as much back in. His arms and back ached with a deep, burning fatigue, his movements becoming slow and clumsy. He was soaked to the bone, his woolen tunic a heavy, freezing weight. The cold was a physical pain, a thing that seemed to seep into his very marrow. The other half of the crew was at the oars, engaged in the most grueling work of their lives. They were not rowing to move the ship forward, but to keep it alive. With each colossal wave that bore down on them, the men would have to row with all their might on one side of the ship, a desperate, coordinated effort to keep the dragon prow pointed directly into the oncoming wall of water. To be caught broadside by such a wave would mean being instantly capsized, a death sentence for all aboard. The oars, which had been instruments of propulsion, were now tools of survival. Great levers used to wrestle with the power of the ocean itself. The strain was immense. The waves would sometimes catch an oar blade and threaten to rip it from the men's hands, a force that could easily break a man's wrist or arm. They rowed in a state of pure adrenaline-fueled desperation, their faces grim masks of concentration, their knuckles white on the slick, wet wood. Through it all, two figures stood as anchors of stability. At the stern, old Eric fought the great steering oar, the IE. He was locked in an intimate, violent dance with the sea. He would use his entire body, his legs braced against the frame of the ship, to control the massive rudder, his face a mask of intense concentration as he read the patterns of the waves and guided the ship through the chaos. His skill, born of a lifetime at sea, was the only thing keeping them from being overwhelmed. And moving amongst the men, his presence a beacon in the storm, was the Jarl. He was not bailing or rowing, but his role was just as vital. He moved from man to man, his voice a powerful, calming roar that could be heard even over the wind. He would offer a word of encouragement, place a steadying hand on a man's shoulder, his own unwavering courage a shield against the rising tide of fear. He was the will of the crew, the embodiment of their collective resolve. In the midst of this chaos, Bjorn felt a strange and terrifying sense of clarity. The petty concerns of his old life, the size of his inheritance, the opinion of the village girls were meaningless. All that existed was this single, brutal moment. There was only the freezing water sloshing around his knees, the burn in his arms as he lifted another bucket, and the grim face of the man working beside him. He felt a profound, unspoken bond with these men. They were no longer just a crew. They were a brotherhood, forged in the heart of the storm. As the day wore on, the storm seemed to find a new level of fury. A wave of truly monstrous size, a rogue wall of black water, rose up out of the gray chaos. It struck the ship not at the prow, but on its side, a glancing but devastating blow. The ship was thrown sideways, and a huge torrent of water crashed onto the deck, sweeping several men from their feet. Bjorn heard a loud, sickening crack as a section of the shield rail splintered. A man near him, one of the younger recruits, was washed against the stored mast with a cry of pain, his arm clearly broken. The ship righted itself, groaning, but the damage was done. The psychological impact of the blow was severe. It was a reminder of their own fragility, of how close they were to disaster at any given moment. The men worked on, but with a new, grim knowledge. The sea was not just a chaotic force. It was a hunter, and it was testing their defenses, searching for a single weakness. And the long, dark, and terrifying night was still to come. As the bruised gray light of the afternoon began to fail, a new and more profound terror settled over the crew. The coming of night. To be caught in such a storm during the day was horrifying enough, but to face it in the absolute disorienting blackness of a moonless, starless night was a trial of the soul. The world, which had been a chaotic canvas of gray and white, was now reduced to a pure, roaring blackness. The only illumination came from the brilliant, terrifying flashes of lightning that would intermittently split the sky. For a split second, the world would be revealed in a stark, ghostly white light, the mountainous churning waves, the deck of the ship awash with water, the grim, pale faces of the crew, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and determination. And then the blackness would rush back in, even more complete than before, leaving only the searing afterimage burned into their vision. In this darkness, the crew fought on, relying not on sight but on sound and feel. They felt the deck shift and plunge beneath their feet. They heard the roar of an approaching wave, a sound that was different from the constant howl of the wind. They worked together in a state of primal instinct, their bodies accustomed to the rhythm of the work, their minds focused only on the next task, the next wave, the next breath. It was in this long, dark night that the crew's minds turned to the old gods and the ancient stories. This was no longer just a storm. This was a battle on a mythological scale. The howling wind was the breath of a great frost giant from the frozen wastes of Jotunheim. The colossal, churning waves were the coils of Jarmungandr, the world serpent, stirring in the great ocean that encircled their world of Midgard. They were not just fighting a storm. They were in the realm of gods and monsters. The lightning was not a natural phenomenon. It was the glint of Thor's hammer as he waged his endless war in the heavens. Every crash of thunder was the sound of his great chariot rolling across the clouds. The men would whisper prayers and curses into the wind, small, desperate appeals to the gods for protection, for their fury to be turned elsewhere. This belief did not necessarily bring comfort, but it gave a terrible, epic meaning to their suffering. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, a new and more immediate crisis struck. A wave even larger than the one that had damaged the shield rail rose up out of the blackness and struck the stern of the ship with the force of a battering ram. The entire vessel shuddered from the impact, and a loud, sickening crack echoed through the roar of the storm. The ship, which had been tenuously held in place by Eric's masterful steering, suddenly began to slew sideways, becoming dangerously unresponsive. The rudder. Eric's voice, for the first time, held a note of genuine alarm. The steering oar is damaged. A wave of pure, cold panic washed over the crew. The steering oar was their only means of control. Without it, the ship would be turned broadside to the waves, and the next great wave would certainly capsize and destroy them. Their fate would be sealed. The Jarl's voice cut through the rising panic, a blade of pure command. Leif, Gunnar, to the stern, we need ropes. A spare oar, now. In the flashing lightning, Bjorn could see a small team of the most experienced men, including the quiet craftsman Leif, scrambling towards the stern. It was a desperate, almost suicidal mission. The stern was the most dangerous part of the ship, the place where the waves crashed with the most fury. It was a race against time. The men had to perform a difficult and delicate repair in the heart of the storm, the pitching darkness, their bodies constantly being battered by waves. Bjorn was part of a human chain, passing tools and ropes from the center of the ship to the men at the stern. He could hear Leif's shouted instructions. The splintered wood of the great steering oar had to be braced. They used a spare rowing, or as a splint, lashing it to the damaged rudder with thick tarred ropes. Their hands were numb with cold, their fingers clumsy, but they worked with a desperate, focused energy. At one point, a wave crashed over the stern, completely submerging the men. For a heart-stopping moment, Bjorn thought they had been washed overboard. But when the water receded, they were still there, clinging to the ropes, their work uninterrupted. After what felt like a lifetime, Leif gave a great shout. It will hold. The repair was a crude, ugly thing, a temporary fix, but it was enough. Bjorn could feel the ship begin to respond again. Old Eric at the helm once more, fighting the sea, bringing the dragon prow back into the wind. A collective, ragged cheer went up from the crew, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the roar of the storm. They had survived another crisis, but the long, dark, and violent night was far from over. The hours that followed the desperate repair of the steering oar were the longest of the voyage. The storm did not abate. It continued its relentless, violent assault, a seemingly endless siege of wind and water. The crew, having expended their last reserves of adrenaline in the crisis, now fell into a state of profound, almost trance-like exhaustion. They worked like automatons, their bodies moving through the familiar rhythms of bailing and holding on, their minds a numb void. Bjorn found himself huddled with several other men near the center of the ship, a place that offered the most stability. They were a silent, shivering mass of wet wool and weary muscle. The cold was a deep, gnawing pain in their bones. Hunger was a distant, unimportant ache. All that mattered was the next wave, the next gust of wind, the next moment of survival. He watched the flashes of lightning, no longer with terror, but with a strange sense of detachment, as if he were a spectator at the world's end. But as the long black night began to give way to the first, faint hint of a bruised gray dawn, a change began to occur. It was a subtle shift, a change in the pitch of the wind. The high, terrifying shriek began to descend into a lower, more guttural moan. The chaotic, battering waves, which had seemed to come from all directions at once, slowly began to organize themselves into a more rhythmic, if still colossal, swell. The storm was not over, but it was breaking. It was exhausting its own fury. As the sun, a pale, watery disk, finally rose above the horizon, it revealed a world of devastation. The Longship, their proud dragon of the sea, was a wreck. The proud carved shield rail was a splintered ruin, several of the brightly painted shields having been torn away by the waves. A number of the precious oars were gone, snapped, or washed overboard. The deck was a chaotic mess of tangled ropes and debris, but she was intact. The mast was secure. The hull was sound. She had endured the sea's worst fury and had not broken. The crew were in a similar state. They were soaked to the bone, their faces pale and drawn with exhaustion, their bodies a canvas of bruises and rope burns. But they were alive. Profound and weary silence settled over the men. They looked at each other, not with triumph, but with the quiet, shared understanding of those who have passed through a great ordeal together. The boasting of Gunnar was gone, replaced by a quiet respect. The new recruits like Bjorn were no longer seen as boys, but as men who had faced their first great storm and had not faltered. The Jarl, his own face grim and tired, led a simple, solemn offering to the gods of the sea. He poured a ladle of ale over the dragon prow, a tribute to Njord for safe passage, and then slammed the butt of his spear on the deck, a salute to Thor for the strength to endure. It was a simple, powerful ritual, a reassertion of their faith in the face of the overwhelming power of nature. The storm had been a crucible for Bjorn. The naive farm boy who had left the fjord was gone, washed away in the fury of the night. In his place was a young man who now understood the true nature of the sea. He had faced a profound elemental terror and had found within himself a core of resilience he never knew he possessed. He looked at the raw, blistered palms of his own hands, not with self-pity, but with a strange, hard-won sense of pride. These were no longer the hands of a farmer. They were the hands of a sailor. In the days that followed, as the sea calmed and the sun returned, the ship was a hive of quiet, methodical activity. The men worked to repair the damage, their movements economical and efficient. Leif, the quiet craftsman, showed Bjorn how to splice a frayed rope and how to patch the damaged sail. There was a new sense of camaraderie, a bond forged in the shared terror of the storm. The men who had survived this together were now more than a crew. They were a brotherhood. As Bjorn sat at his oar bench, chewing on a piece of dry fish, he felt a sense of belonging that was deeper and more real than anything he had ever known. He had earned his place here. He was a seafarer, a member of the crew, a man of the Longship. His initial journey, the transformation from boy to Viking, was complete. The storm had washed away his past, and in its wake it had left a man. In the aftermath of the great storm, a new and wholly different trial began. The sea, having exhausted its rage, now fell into a deep and profound slumber. For days, and then for weeks, the Longship was becalmed, trapped on a vast, glassy plain of dark water under a hazy, indifferent sun. The wind, which had been their tormentor, was now a ghost, its absence a new and more insidious form of torture. The great red sail, patched and repaired, hung limp and useless against the mast. This was a new kind of hell. The fury of the storm had been a thing to be fought, a clear and present enemy that focused the mind and forged a bond of shared survival. This oppressive calm, however, was a battle against nothingness. The ship was motionless, a tiny speck of wood and men suspended in an endless, shimmering void. The horizon was a perfect, unbroken circle, the same in every direction, offering no sense of progress, no hope of change. The oars were now their only means of propulsion, their only hope of escape. The crew returned to the grueling, monotonous rhythm of rowing, but it was different now. Before, they had rowed with a purpose, to supplement the wind or to maneuver the ship. Now, they rowed against the dead weight of the entire ocean. Their progress was agonizingly slow. They would row for an entire day under the burning sun, their bodies screaming with the effort, only to find themselves, by Eric's celestial calculations, a few miserable miles closer to their destination. The sun, which they had longed for during the darkness of the storm, now became their new enemy. It beat down on them relentlessly, its heat amplified by the reflection off the glassy water. There was no shade on the open deck. The men's skin, accustomed to the cold and damp, now burned and blistered. The tar in the seams of the hull would grow soft and sticky in the heat, filling the air with its thick, acrid smell. But the greatest and most terrifying hardship was the dwindling supply of fresh water. The great wave that had struck them during the storm had not just splintered the shield rail. It had washed a precious barrel of drinking water overboard. At the time, in the chaos of the moment, the loss had been a secondary concern. Now it was the only thing on any man's mind. The Jarl immediately instituted a strict rationing. The men's daily allotment of water, already meager, was cut in half. Each man would receive a single, small cup of lukewarm, stale water in the morning, and another in the evening. It was barely enough to sustain a man sitting still, let alone one performing hours of hard labor at the oar. Thirst became a constant, tormenting presence. Bjorn's mouth was always dry, his lips cracked and sore. He would dream of the cold, clear streams of his home, only to wake up to the harsh, salty reality of the sea. The men learned to lick the morning dew from the ship's railings, like a few precious, tasteless drops of moisture that did little to quench the deep cellular thirst that consumed them. The food, too, became a greater trial. The hard, dried biscuits seemed to turn to dust in their mouths, and the heavily salted fish only intensified their thirst. The simple act of eating became a chore, a necessary but unpleasant task to fuel the body for the next round of rowing. The shared meals, which had once been a time of camaraderie and storytelling, now became a tense, silent affair, each man jealously guarding his small ration. The psychological toll of this new ordeal was immense. The camaraderie that had been forged in the storm began to fray under the relentless pressure of the heat, the thirst, and the hopelessness. Tempers grew short. Small arguments would break out over a spilled drop of water or a perceived slight. The easy companionship was replaced by a sullen, watchful suspicion. Bjorn watched as the crew, which had seemed so unbreakable, began to slowly come apart at the seams. The songs and the sagas fell silent. The games of Hennefatov lay forgotten in the sea chests. There was no energy for anything but the grim, necessary tasks of survival. The men would spend their off-duty hours sitting in silence, staring at the empty horizon, their faces grim, their minds lost in their own private worlds of thirst and despair. The enemy was no longer the sea, it was the silence, the sun, and the slow, creeping madness of being trapped in a beautiful calm and utterly unforgiving hell. As the days of dead calm stretched into a week, the psychological fabric of the crew began to unravel. The camaraderie that had been forged in the shared terror of the storm was a fragile thing. It began to fray under the relentless, quiet pressure of their new ordeal. Men who had worked together as a single unified body now retreated into themselves, their faces sullen masks of thirst and simmering resentment. Tempers already worn thin by hunger and exhaustion grew shorter with each passing windless day. Small arguments would flare up over nothing, a misplaced tool, a perceived insult. The easy, guttural laughter that had once filled the ship was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. The men were like a pack of wolves trapped together in a cage, their natural aggression turning inward. The boastful warrior, Gunnar, became a particular source of tension. His bravado, which had been a source of amusement in the early days of the voyage, now soured into a dangerous, restless anger. He would pace the small confines of the deck, his eyes glaring, looking for a target for his frustration. He started to openly question the Jarl's leadership. "Odin has abandoned us," he would say, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "We are adrift because our Jarl's luck has run out." This was a dangerous sentiment, a poison that could spread quickly through a desperate crew. The Jarl, who had led them with a calm and steady hand, knew he had to act. One evening, after Gunnar picked a fight with a younger rower over a ration of fish, the Jarl confronted him. He did not shout, he simply stood before the larger man, his gaze as cold and hard as the winter sea. "My luck has not run out," the Jarl said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight of absolute authority. "But my patience has. You will not sow dissent on my ship. We will survive this as a crew, or we will die as a crew. There is no other way." He then sentenced Gunnar to a day and a night at the steering oar, a grueling, solitary, and deeply humbling task. A punishment that was both just and wise. The challenge to his authority was quashed, but the underlying tension remained. In the absence of wind, the crew's minds turned to the gods and to superstition. They began to believe they were cursed. Perhaps they had offended Nerd, the god of the sea, or Thor, the god of the skies. They began to see bad omens in everything, a strange pattern in the clouds, the way a piece of seaweed drifted by the hull, the sighting of a lone black-backed gull. All were interpreted as signs of the gods' displeasure. Desperate to appease these unseen forces, they began to make more significant sacrifices. A fine iron axe head was given to the sea, a valuable tool dropped into the depths with a solemn prayer. A man would prick his finger and let a few drops of blood fall into the water. A personal offering. Leif, the quiet craftsman, spent a day meticulously carving a complex rune of protection onto a spear, or which was then set adrift, a silent plea sent out into the void. Bjorn watched all of this with a growing sense of a new kind of fear. He had been afraid during the storm, a simple, primal fear of death. But this was different. This was the fear of watching the minds of men come undone. He saw the grim resignation on the faces of the veterans like Eric, and he saw the rising, desperate anger in the eyes of men like Gunnar. He felt as if the ship itself was a living thing, slowly suffocating in the still heavy air. He found a strange solace in his work. The simple, repetitive tasks of checking the rigging or mending a rope were an anchor in a world that felt increasingly unreal. He would have quiet conversations with Leif, who seemed to be the only other person who remained untouched by the growing paranoia. "The sea gives and the sea takes," the old craftsman said one evening, as they watched the sun set in another perfect windless sky. "We can only be patient. The wind will return when it is ready." But as the second week of the dead calm began, Even Leif's stoic wisdom began to feel like a hollow comfort. The last of the water barrels was opened, and the men could see the bottom. Their thirst was now a constant raging fire. Their bodies were weak, their minds clouded by dehydration. They were adrift, both literally and metaphorically, a ghost ship crewed by ghosts, waiting for a wind that might never come in the middle of a vast and silent ocean. The Longship drifted under the relentless sun, a coffin of tarred wood on an endless flat sea. The crew, weakened by thirst and hollowed out by despair, had fallen into a state of listless lethargy. They moved only when necessary, their actions slow and mechanical. The grueling work of rowing had all but ceased. The men simply did not have the strength, and the Jarl knew that to force them would be to kill them. They were now at the complete mercy of the gods and the ocean. Bjorn lay on the deck, his back against his sea chest, his head in the small patch of shade cast by the gunwale. His throat was a dry, rasping desert. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache from the dehydration. He watched the hazy, shimmering horizon, his eyes unfocused. He had all but given up hope. He was a boy from the fjords. He had never imagined that a man could die of thirst while surrounded by so much water. It was old Eric the helmsman who first noticed the change. He had been staring out at the empty sea for days, his expression a mask of grim stoicism. But now his eyes, which had been dull with fatigue, sharpened with a new intensity. He lifted a bony hand and pointed to the north. "Birds," he croaked, his voice a dry whisper. Bjorn, with a great effort, lifted his head. At first he saw nothing. Then he spotted them. Small dark flock of birds flying low and fast over the water. They were not the usual gulls that had followed them from the coast. These were gannets, large seabirds with long pointed wings. He watched them, his mind slowly processing the significance of the sight. The older sailors began to stir, a flicker of life returning to their vacant eyes. Gannets were creatures of the deep ocean, but they always, without fail, returned to land to roost at night, and these birds were not circling aimlessly. They were flying with a clear and determined purpose in a straight, unwavering line. They were flying towards home. Their home was land. A low murmur went through the ship, a sound of fragile hope. For the first time in weeks, the men had a sign, a direction, a reason to believe that this ocean had an end. As if the birds were a message from the gods, another change occurred a few hours later. A faint, almost imperceptible coolness touched Bjorn's sunburnt cheek. He sat up, his heart suddenly pounding. He looked at the surface of the water. The glassy mirror-like sheen was gone, replaced by the faintest, most delicate of ripples. A small piece of thread that Leif had tied to the rigging, a makeshift wind indicator, which had been hanging limp for weeks, began to stir. It was a breeze. It was not a strong wind, not a gale, but a gentle, hesitant breath of air, the first they had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. The crew, who had been lying listlessly on the deck, slowly began to sit up. A collective ragged sigh of relief, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, went through the ship. Old Eric let out a single harsh laugh, a sound like stones grinding together. The Jarl rose to his feet, his own face cracked and dry, but his eyes now burning with a renewed fire. "Raise the sail," he commanded, his voice no longer a quiet word of management, but a true booming command. The crew, re-energized by the return of hope, moved to their tasks. Their movements were slow, their bodies weak from thirst and hunger, but they worked with a desperate, joyful purpose. Bjorn pulled on the heavy, stiff ropes, his muscles protesting, his raw hands screaming, but he did not care. He could feel the wind on his face, a cool, life-giving caress. The great red sail was hoisted up the mast, and as it unfurled, it bellied out, catching the new breeze. With a low groan of waking timbers, the Longship began to move. The sound of the hull cutting through the water, a gentle hiss and ripple, was the most beautiful music Bjorn had ever heard. It was the sound of escape, the sound of life. The ship was no longer a coffin, it was a living thing once more. Its dragon prow pointed north, in the direction the birds had shown them. As the afternoon wore on, the breeze strengthened into a steady, reliable wind. A new routine took hold, the familiar tasks of sailing. The atmosphere on the ship was transformed. Sullen silence was replaced by a low hum of activity and quiet, hopeful conversation. The men shared the last of the water, a celebratory ration, their spirits lifted. That evening, as the ship sailed steadily under a sky now filled with scattered, fast-moving clouds, Brand, the old skald, even found the strength to tell a short tale. He spoke of Thor's fishing trip, when he almost pulled the world serpent from the depths of the ocean. A story of a great struggle against a monstrous foe. The men listened, their faces thoughtful in the twilight. They had just fought their own battle with the great serpent, and they had survived. Bjorn sat at his post, his hand on a rope, feeling the steady pull of the wind. His body was still weak, his thirst still a painful presence. But his spirit, which had been a dying ember, was now a small, bright flame. The ordeal of being becalmed was over. Their destination was no longer a fading memory or a desperate prayer. It was a real place, somewhere over the horizon. For the first time in a very long time, he truly believed they would reach it. For 2 more days, the Longship sailed north under a steady, favorable wind. The mood on board was one of quiet, focused anticipation. The crew, though still gaunt and weary from their ordeal, now moved with a renewed sense of purpose. The work of sailing, which had been a torment during the long, becalmed weeks, now felt like a joyous and meaningful act. Every adjustment of the sail, every creak of the rigging, was a sound that brought them closer to their destination. The signs of land began to appear, small, hopeful messages from the world ahead. The seabirds were no longer solitary visitors, but great wheeling flocks. The water itself began to change, its deep. Oceanic blue-green shifting to a cloudier, more vibrant shade, a sign of shallower waters. And then, one morning, Bjorn noticed a new smell on the wind. It was not the clean, sharp scent of salt and sea, but a rich, complex aroma of damp earth, of pine needles, of wood smoke. It was the smell of land. Hope, which had been a fragile, flickering ember, now became a steady, burning flame in the hearts of the crew. The men began to talk of what they would do when they arrived, of the taste of fresh meat and strong ale, of the feel of solid, unmoving ground beneath their feet. A lookout was posted at the top of the mast, a young boy with the sharpest eyes, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon. Happened in the late afternoon. Cry came from the masthead, a high-pitched, jubilant shout that cut through the air. Land. Land. A moment of stunned silence fell over the ship. And then a great, roaring cheer erupted from the 60 men, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy and relief that seemed to shake the very timbers of the ship. The crew scrambled to the side of the vessel, their eyes all straining in the same direction. At first, Bjorn could see nothing but the empty line where the sea met the sky. Then he saw it. A faint, dark, almost imperceptible smudge on the horizon, a line that was different from the perfect flatness of the ocean. It was land. It was real. After months of being trapped in a world of only two colors, gray water and gray sky, the sight of that distant, solid darkness was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. As they sailed closer, the smudge slowly resolved into a coastline of dark, rocky cliffs and deep green forests. It was a wild, untamed-looking place, but it was land. It was a new world. The Jarl, after consulting with old Eric, chose a sheltered inlet, a place where a wide, sandy beach offered a safe place to land the Longship. With a final, skillful push from the oarsmen, the ship entered the calm water of the inlet. The sound of the waves on the open sea was replaced by the gentle lapping of water against a shore. And then, with a low, satisfying, grinding sound, the keel of the Longship slid onto the sand of the beach. The voyage was over. For a moment, the crew sat in a state of stunned, blissful silence. Then, with a great collective shout, they began to leap over the sides of the ship, into the shallow, refreshingly cold water. Bjorn jumped with them, and the feeling of the solid, sandy bottom beneath his feet was so strange and so wonderful that his legs almost gave way. He waded through the shallows and collapsed onto the damp sand of the beach, pressing the palms of his hands flat against the ground, a gesture of pure, grateful reverence. Their first priority was fresh water. They found a small stream of clear, cold water trickling down from the wooded hills, and they drank. They drank until their stomachs ached, the taste of the pure, clean water a miracle on their salt-parched tongues. At night, they built a great bonfire on the beach, its flames leaping high into the night sky, a beacon of their arrival. They feasted on the mussels they gathered from the rocks and the last of their good rations, and they told the story of their own voyage, their own saga of survival. Later that night, Bjorn walked to the water's edge. The Longship was resting on the sand, its dragon head silhouetted against the stars, looking like some great beast asleep after a long and arduous journey. He looked back at his own hands, at the raw, scarred palms, and at his own thinned, hardened body. The boy who had left the fjord so many months ago was gone. In his place was a man who had faced the fury of the storm and the despair of the dead calm, and had endured. He looked ahead at the dark, silent, and unknown forest of this new land. The great journey across the sea was over, but he knew with a certainty that was both frightening and exhilarating, that a new adventure, a new story, was only just beginning. And so the long voyage of Bjorn and his crew comes to an end. Theirs is a story of endurance, a testament to the courage and skill of the men who sailed these dragon ships across the vast unknown oceans. It is a story written not in ink on parchment, but in the salt spray on a weathered face, in the calluses on a rower's hands, and in the quiet, shared understanding of those who have survived the great and terrible power of the sea. Their long journey is over. Their ship is at rest. And now, your journey for tonight can come to a peaceful close as well. There are no more storms to endure, no more oars to pull. There is only the quiet of this moment. Let the story fade, and allow your mind to drift into a deep and well-deserved rest. Sleep well.